Thank you so much, Dr. Affolthaler. Thank you so much, Dr. Damoué. Thank you to California Lutheran University. And thank you to all of you. I really appreciate this because this is a unique opportunity to talk about an issue that is very rarely addressed by the media, government, and society. Simply because those who are in power and who directly benefit from the current situation, from the current arrangement, from the current structures, are not interested in making people aware about the root causes of immigration. So, as a consequence, at the question of why people come here, most people make the very simplistic assumption that immigrants come here because they are poor and we are rich. But the truth is that the reasons for immigration are very complex, and we must become aware that we share a great degree of responsibility on these issues. So, the point I want to make is that we really want to solve the issue of immigration. We must stop looking only at the consequences and start addressing the root causes of immigration, because this is the only way to really solve the immigration conundrum. So in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on Mexico because it has been for many decades the main source of immigrants to the United States, to California, and to Ventura County due to our geographic proximity, but even more so after NAFTA came into effect in 1994. So, what are the underlying causes of immigration? Well, these are systemic and global economic structures that cause millions of people to lose any opportunity to enjoy a dignified quality of life in their own country. As the direct result of the tacit agreement between the elites of both countries, yes, both countries, Mexico and the United States, and not just the United States, to impose and maintain the neoliberal economic structures that benefit them, the 1%, or I rather say the less than 1%, and decimate the livelihoods of the vast majority of the 99%. But what are the specific economic structures that trigger immigration? Well, these are primarily two. The first one is wages that can only be construed in what I call a system or a standard of modern slave work wages, and predatory trade agreements impacting specific economic sectors with consequences that plunder the standard of living of millions of people. Wages have indeed been decimated for the last 36 years in Mexico as a result of a consistent and deliberate economic policy to impose neoliberal structures worldwide, structures that replace what I call put money in the workers' pockets or demand side economics with put money in the employers' pockets or supply side economics. These are policies that specifically reduce and limit labor rights through structural reforms, reduce real wages to increase competitive advantages, privatize public assets and natural resources vital for life, and deregulate economic and financial structures to allow markets, yes, the markets, to set the public agenda and allow them, the markets again, to regulate themselves through non-binding, self-designed guidelines and standards. So in these settles, wages are decimated to attract as much foreign direct investment as possible by offering labor costs at bondage prices, and predatory trade agreements such as NAFTA are created to develop a regional system for global corporations to create what is called the global commodity supply chains, with huge increases in productivity made possible by dramatically reducing labor costs in a good portion of their global manufacturing supply chains. Now, to duly address the root causes of immigration, we must do it in the context of a living wage ethos, which I am sure that most of you are already aware that a living wage is a human right internationally recognized. And this concept is extremely important. Equal pay for equal work of equal value is the pillar sustaining it. So Because of this, the ILO has established for decades that for a fair globalization, the decent work concept has led to an international consensus that productive employment and decent work are key elements to achieving poverty reduction. Accordingly, rather than driving people into the informal economy, such as in the case of Mexico, where nearly 60% of all workers work in the informal economy, or creating massive migrations, which is also the case for Mexico, global expansion must find ways to deliver opportunities for decent work where people live. So the living wage anchored on the pillar of equal pay for equal work of equal value has been enshrined for many decades as a human right in international law. There is nothing new with that. So we have it in Article 23 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 concerning the right of workers to equal pay for equal work. We also have it in Article 7 of the UN's International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of 1966 for fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value. And of course, we have it in ILO's Convention 100 of equal pay for work of equal value. Now, let's look from a global perspective at manufacturing, and we're going to observe an ethos of asymmetric wage rates in North America in the context of, once again, equal pay for equal work of equal value. But in order to do that, I am going to ask you to do with me the following exercise, and that is that we're going to ask ourselves the following question. Why, if a worker working for Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, putting 4 parts in the Ford assembly line of the Ford Focus, what if he makes $40 an hour? A worker working also for Ford Motor Company, but this time in Mexico, putting exactly the same 4 parts in exactly the same Ford assembly line of the Ford Focus, makes only $4 an hour, or about 10%, when the cost of living is not 10%. Well, it is a lot more. So let's look at this using real figures in manufacturing. So we're going to look at the nominal hourly wage rate in manufacturing in 2016, and we're going to see that in the United States it was $39.03. But in Mexico it was only $3.91, so about 10%. But the cost of living is not 10%, it's actually 54% in 2016. So that means that that worker, for doing the exact same job, again, in the context of equal pay for equal work of equal value, that worker should have been paid $21.15. But he was only paid $3.91. So accounting for inflation, accounting for cost of living differences, that worker was actually paid 18% of what he should have been paid in the first place. Now, I'm going to ask you to bear in mind for 1 second that 18%, because now we're going to look at how wages have been decimated in Mexico over time. So that 18%, if we go back to 1975, it was actually 37%, and then it went up to 42% in 1980, and in fact in 1981 it achieved its highest point at 44%, and then it started going down to 33, to 28, and by the time NAFTA became effective in 1994, it was already down at 19%. And as you can observe, as you can see, ever since that time, it has become a flat line as the direct result of a deliberate economic policy to plunder wages in Mexico. Now, continuing with the manufacturing sector from a global perspective, we're going to look at the effects of NAFTA 1.0 in the inbound plant sector of the global commodity chains in place in Mexico. And we're going to look at its main features. And so before NAFTA in 1976, the sector had 448 plants employing 74,500 workers. So at that time, it was really marginal to the Mexican economy. But after NAFTA, more than 20 years after NAFTA, in 2017, the sector reported 6,166 plants employing almost 2.9 million workers at, once again, modern slave work prices. And so the level of exploitation, labor and human rights violations, and workplace hazards and insecurity is the worst in the industrial sector, including the murder or disappearance of thousands of female maquiladora workers in Ciudad Juarez and many cities along the US-Mexico border. And so the main reason for offshoring into Mexico is, once again, cheap labor costs that allow employers to maximize their return on investment and shareholder value. Now, we have already looked at the global perspective. Now let's look at the domestic perspective. And so we're going to look at the value of wages from a domestic perspective in Mexico versus the minimum necessary to enjoy a dignified quality of life. And this is the comparison between the monthly general minimum wage in pesos against what is called the indispensable basket of goods, which is considered the standard for the minimum necessary to enjoy a dignified quality of life. In other words, the standard for a living wage. And so in 2014, the cost of that basket of goods was in pesos 16,445 pesos. But the minimum wage was only 2,019 pesos. So the affordability of that basket by the minimum wage was only 12% in 2014. Now, looking at this year in 2019, the cost of that basket is estimated at 22,000 pesos, and the minimum wage has grown to 3,080 pesos. But the affordability has barely improved, only 2 points to 14%. Of course, as in any economy, many workers in Mexico make much more than one minimum wage. They make 3, 4, or much more than one minimum wage. So we're going to look at the distribution of wage earners in Mexico by the number of minimum wages in 2018. And so according to the Mexican government, with official figures, 74% of all employed persons in 2018 earned not more than 5 minimum wages. But it takes more than 7 minimum wages to afford the indispensable basket of goods. In other words, it takes more than 7 minimum wages to earn a living wage. So with that data, we can confidently say that not more than 15% of all wage earners in Mexico were able to enjoy a living wage in 2018. Now, we're going to do the exact same exercise going back to the global perspective in manufacturing. And we're going to look at the affordability of the indispensable basket of goods by the best paid workers in the economy. And so the estimated monthly cost of the indispensable basket of goods in dollars in 2016 was $991, but the monthly net income after taxes of manufacturing workers was only $488. So the affordability of that basket by the best paid workers in the economy in 2016 was only 49%, not even half. Now, let's look at the other sector that has been greatly impacted by NAFTA, and that is the agricultural sector. And so, what is the direct effect of NAFTA on the loss of millions of jobs in agriculture? Well, NAFTA's rather pernicious effects destroy or reduce the quality of life of millions of people in the three countries, particularly in the agricultural sector due to agribusiness. But it was in Mexico where the greatest damage was inflicted. Now, let's look first at what happened in the United States. So, just between 1996 and 2001, farming subsidies nearly tripled to more than $20 billion. However, net income of farmers dropped 16.5%, forcing about 300,000 farmers, mostly small farmers, out of business. As a result, many rural communities died as storefronts were boarded up, churches were closed down, people were forced from their homes by the toxic fumes of industrial animal factories, and an amphetamine epidemic swept the United States. Now, in Mexico, NAFTA liberalized corn and maintained other products such as sugar and beans. But because of that 20 billion that the US government gave to agribusiness, large agribusiness corporations such as Cargill and ADM flooded the Mexican market with subsidized products at prices below production cost in Mexico. So as a consequence, by 2006, over 2 million agricultural jobs, including 1.7 million small farmers, were lost, and workers, farmers, and their families were forced to leave the countryside. And when I say that 2 million jobs were lost, it really means that 8 million people lost their livelihoods, because the average number of members per household in Mexico is 4. So if 2 million jobs were lost, it really means that 8 million people lost their livelihoods. So millions of Mexicans left their towns. They were forced to leave their towns with 3 choices. The first choice was to move to the slums of Mexico's big cities and seek work, mostly in the underground economy, at, once again, modern slave work wages. The second choice was to come here, to migrate to the United States despite the perils of coming here without proper documentation. And the third choice, the choice of last recourse, of course, was to join the ranks of people working for the drug cartels or other forms of organized crimes. Now, continuing with NAFTA, let's look at the potential effect of the upcoming NAFTA 2.0 on Mexican wages. And there are 2 major provisions, one that is potentially positive and the other one that is potentially negative. So let's look first at the positive one. So there is a potentially positive new labor provision if it is enforced, and that is that first, Mexico's labor reform to incorporate ILO's Convention number 98 of 1949, which is the right to organize and collective bargaining, was finally ratified in 2018 by the Mexican Congress. And so what this means is that in line with this convention, NAFTA's 2.0 text includes modest but meaningful labor standard gains. And also I might say that by Mexico ratifying this convention, it has ratified the 8 fundamental conventions of the ILO. The ILO has over 100 conventions, but there are 8 fundamental or core conventions of the ILO. And this is really ironic, and I want to make a point of this. This is really ironic because by ratifying this convention, Mexico has ratified the 8 fundamental conventions, but the United States has only ratified 2 so far. So what this really means is that far more important than ratifying international or domestic conventions that protect labor rights, the critical issue is enforcement of the labor rights. So, as I said, in line with this convention, the NAFTA text includes modest but meaningful labor standard gains, and the key one is the rules to end wage suppression protection contracts in Mexico, which is closely related to this convention. And what this means is that the standard in Mexico forever has been these protection contracts that with corrupt labor leaders that work really for the employers of both domestic and multinational corporations in Mexico allow these employers to pay a hunger wage, a modern slave work wage to Mexican workers. That's how it has been operating for decades, forever really. So if these protections are enforced, this could make a real difference over time to raise Mexican wages, which also, by the way, it would cut incentives to outsource jobs to Mexico. However, so far NAFTA's 2.0 text lacks the monitoring or enforcement terms necessary for the rules to make a difference for workers. But if this changes and the new rules are enforced, it would be very positive. Now, let's look at the other potential, the other provision which could be potentially and rather negative if it materializes. So this is what is called a new rules of origin provision for the motor vehicle industry, Article 7 of NAFTA 2.0, where parties agreed on a labor value content of 40% for passenger vehicles and 45% for light and heavy trucks. So what this means is that 40 to 45% of the value of cars and light and heavy trucks must be produced by workers paid at the very least $16 an hour in order to qualify as originating in North America in order to enjoy a zero trade tariffs. Well, the first problem is that this is rather difficult to calculate, the real effect of this, because only other firms know precisely where each element of their product is made, and so far there is no process in place to assess this effect. But the much bigger problem is the potential of a double-edged sword. And what I mean is that this could well be very positive by pressuring corporations to increase wages in Mexico. But it can also be a Trojan horse from the Trump administration against Mexico. So let me explain. In 2016, the hourly total compensation costs in the automotive industry were for Mexico $4.68, for the US $48.97, and for Canada $34.19. So for the US and Canada, as you can see, this is really a non-issue because their hourly wage rates are far above the $16 threshold. Well, for Mexico, this is a huge problem because there is a huge gap between $4.68 and the $16 threshold. So the gaps on real purchasing power parity wages in manufacturing, and specifically in the automotive industry, are so enormous that it would take at the very least 2 decades to fully close them, from $4.68 to $26.54, not even counting for inflation. So now let's look at the potential possible scenario. And this is that the new Mexican government committed to recover real wages and has already increased the minimum wage in 2019 by an unprecedented 16.2%. And I say unprecedented because for more than 3 decades, the minimum wage in Mexico was increased below inflation as the direct result, like I said before, of a deliberate economic policy to plunder wages in Mexico. But even if we make a simplistic assumption and apply the actual increase for 2019 of 16.2% to the minimum wage to modern industry wages, and we project to achieve a nominal wage of just $16 an hour, we have made a projection and it would take roughly 8 years to reach the motor vehicle threshold if all assumptions, that is, if inflation, cost of living, and exchange rates materialize, if they hold. So, as you can see in this chart, it would take 8 years to go from the $4.70 here to the $16 here. But knowing Trump, if he's still in power for another term, he could easily demand that a chunk of motor vehicle production from Mexico be transferred to the United States, arguing that Mexico did not comply with the local value content of $16 an hour. And if this happens, it would be extremely detrimental to Mexico and especially to Mexican workers, because this is the best paid sector in the economy and this is the most important sector in NAFTA. Because manufacturing, 80% of everything that Mexico exports to the United States in NAFTA comes from manufacturing. And about 70% of all manufacturing exports come from the motor vehicle industry. So it would be extremely detrimental if this happens. So, from a global perspective, in conclusion, since NAFTA, it can clearly be asserted that the modern slave work ethos in place in Mexico subsidizes the U.S. economy and U.S. population in terms of capital extraction for the benefit of the shareholder value of institutional investors of international financial markets, both in manufacturing and agriculture. Wages and salaries of U.S. workers and employees who are part of the global supply chain, and also U.S. consumers paying much lower prices. Now, let's briefly look at the consequences of Mexico's modern slave work ethos in immigration flows. So between 2000 and 2005, more than 400,000 Mexicans, mostly from rural communities, moved annually to the United States. So by 2009, more than 12 million had moved to the US. But undocumented immigration stabilized by 2014 at around 11 million as a result of the increased criminalization of immigration and the emergence of its incarceration industrial complex. As a result, the number of undocumented Mexican immigrants in the US has steadily decreased and stabilized at around 5 million. Yet, and this is really important, nearly 200,000 continue to cross the border from Mexico annually, with even more from Central America and many other countries. So, a situation that I can guarantee you that will continue as long as the root causes of immigration remain unaddressed. Now, who benefits from these systemic structures? Well, first, the institutional investors of international financial markets and their corporations by maximizing their shareholder value. Also, politicians both in the US and Mexico by getting financial support for their electoral campaigns in exchange for imposing the market-driven agenda designed by the business elites. Also, the savings in slave wages paid in Mexico help a lot to subsidize the much higher wages paid to equivalent workers in the US of the same corporations. In fact, globally, it is estimated that 25 to 40% of the cost of labor in the North is subsidized by the South's meager wages. And lastly, US consumers also greatly benefit from bondage wages paid in Mexico by enjoying much lower prices than if the entire production would be made in the United States. So we must become aware that we are also supporting with our consumer choices this system of global exploitation. In conclusion, the South subsidizes the North's economic growth in terms of shareholder value, workers' wages, and consumer prices. Now, how can we address the root causes of immigration? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to become aware about the hurdles, and there are three major hurdles. The first one is that the same systemic structures that benefit from this arrangement oppose any type of binding regulatory framework via either national and/or international law to force global corporations to pay living wages to all their workers. Also, and as a consequence, the voluntary concept of corporate social responsibility, so-called corporate social responsibility, is really a public relations hoax because these companies have systematically refused to incorporate a living wage standard in their voluntary guidelines. And we can write, and we must write to our members of Congress, but we must be aware that it has a relative effect because the same systemic structures that benefit from this arrangement finance the political campaigns of many of them. Not all, but many of them. So we are left with two tools. The first one is to increasing our pressure using our consumer power, which, by the way, is a very powerful tool if it is well organized, and to increasing our pressure with our members of Congress. Lastly, what can we do as responsible citizens in practical terms to effectively address the root causes of immigration? Well, the first thing and the easiest one is to use our consumer power to make well-informed and socially and environmentally conscious decisions to support responsible companies and reject irresponsible ones. We should also join consumer organizations and ask them to include in their own agenda a project to push for a living wage standard in the guidelines used by corporations voluntarily. And we should and we must write to our members of Congress and ask them to push for binding legislation that would force corporations to pay living wages globally. So as you can see, the key factor in addressing the root causes of immigration is obviously the living wage. Because I can guarantee you 100% that if we organize successfully and we're able to successfully force corporations to start paying living wages to their Mexican workers, I can guarantee you that Mexican workers would be more than happy to remain in their own country to enjoy a dignified quality of life by earning a living wage. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you again.